Welcome to this audiobook of The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. This is an extended and detailed summary produced exclusively by Audiomentors, with the purpose of providing you with an in-depth and accessible analysis of one of the most influential texts in political theory. Throughout this summary, we will explore the fundamental principles of power, political strategy, and the decisions a prince must make to consolidate and maintain his rule. If you have found this content interesting, we invite you to subscribe to our channel to continue learning from the best books on personal development, strategy, and philosophy. At Audiomentors, we are committed to offering you valuable summaries that help you grow and apply these principles to your life and daily decisions. Stay with us and take your knowledge to the next level. Now, without further ado, enjoy this journey through the key ideas of The Prince and how Machiavelli can teach us about power, politics, and leadership. Let's get started. Chapter 1. Introduction. The purpose of the book. In the first chapter of The Prince, Niccolò Machiavelli lays out the foundation for his work, delving into the purpose of writing a guide for princes on how to acquire, consolidate, and maintain power. This introduction serves to place the reader in the political and philosophical context of the time, highlighting the relevance of the principles presented throughout the text. Initial reflections on power and government. Machiavelli begins The Prince by acknowledging that the principles he sets forth are not meant to be a moral ideal, but rather a reflection on the reality of power. In his time, Italy lived in constant political fragmentation, with small principalities and large city-states, each seeking to expand their influence or defend their autonomy. This gives Machiavelli the perspective of a realist thinker who is unwilling to embellish politics or hide the methods he believes are necessary to maintain power. One of the main ideas that Machiavelli sets forth is that political power should not depend on idealism or abstract values, but on practical strategies and actions based on the context in which the ruler finds himself. Unlike other treatises of the time, which emphasized virtue or justice as fundamental principles of a ruler, Machiavelli proposes a pragmatic vision. The prince must be shrewd, flexible, and willing to use any means necessary to achieve his ends, if this serves to preserve his domain. The reality of power. Politics without illusions. One of the criticisms that Machiavelli makes in his introduction is that, in his time, princes were seen more as moral leaders than as political strategists. For Machiavelli, this vision is useless and dangerous in the real world, since leaders cannot always allow themselves to be virtuous if it compromises their power. Thus, the prince challenges the traditional ideas about politics and offers an approach based on practical actions and efficiency in governance. Morality and virtue are relative. According to Machiavelli, the prince must adapt to the circumstances and needs of his time. In this way, the book suggests that the truly successful leader is not one who is governed by absolute principles, but rather one who knows when to be severe, when to use diplomacy, and when to act with mercy. The ability to change behavior depending on the situation is what distinguishes a strong leader from a weak leader who is dragged down by circumstances or morality. Machiavelli uses historical examples from figures such as Caesar Borgia, who, despite his cruel and ruthless methods, is presented as an example of a prince capable of maintaining power and progressing his domain. Throughout the work, the author shows how cunning, deception, and manipulation can be used as valid strategies in politics, as long as they focus on the good of the state and permanence in power. Fortune and virtue. The role of luck in politics. Another key point in this introduction is the relationship between fortune and virtue. According to Machiavelli, princes must be aware of the luck, or fortune, that influences political life, but they must also have enough virtue to take advantage of the opportunities that fortune presents them. Virtue in this context is not a moral virtue, but a combination of strategic intelligence, flexibility, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Machiavelli is very clear in pointing out that fortune is not a completely uncontrollable factor. A skillful prince can influence outcomes and circumstances. However, he also recognizes that fortune has considerable influence, especially in times of war and conflict situations, where external factors can change the course of history. Therefore, the prince must be prepared to face fortune bravely and use his virtue to create opportunities in the midst of adversity. The purpose of the book. Practical advice for rulers. In this introduction, Machiavelli also clarifies that the purpose of The Prince is to provide practical and strategic advice to rulers so that they can be more effective in managing their kingdoms. Instead of looking for an abstract philosophical work or a moral manual on good government, the author addresses those who exercise or aspire to exercise political power with the aim of providing concrete tools to consolidate their influence. Machiavelli's advice is intended to be applied in a world where politics is a constant field of struggle. Instead of getting lost in ethical theories, princes must make decisions based on what works in practice, despite the consequences those decisions may have on traditional morality. The ultimate goal is always the preservation of the power and prosperity of the state, regardless of the methods used to achieve those objectives. Conclusion of the introduction: a change of perspective in politics. The first chapter clearly establishes the tone of the work, a practical and realistic analysis of political power, focused on strategy and efficiency. Machiavelli does not present an ideal of leadership based on virtue, but rather a pragmatic approach, facing the real difficulties of power with a calculating and practical spirit. This approach leads us to a new vision of politics, where power is based not on traditional morality or good character, but on a leader's ability to adapt to changing circumstances and use the most effective means to consolidate his power. Position. The prince must learn to navigate the turbulent waters of fortune with cunning and determination to be truly successful. This first chapter establishes the foundation for what will be developed in the rest of the book. Throughout The Prince, Machiavelli will offer a series of concrete strategies, stories of past leaders, and principles of governance that the prince must employ to ensure his power and maintain stability in his domain. Chapter 2. The different kinds of principalities. In this chapter, Niccolò Machiavelli delves into the classification of principalities, exploring their different types and the nature of the challenges each presents. For Machiavelli, the type of principality that a prince possesses has a great influence on the strategies he must follow to consolidate his power and maintain stability. The analysis of the different types of principalities is crucial to understanding how a leader should act depending on the nature of his domain. Analysis of the types of principalities. Hereditary, new, and mixed. Machiavelli divides principalities into three main categories: hereditary, new, and mixed. Each type of principality has unique characteristics that affect how a prince should rule and maintain his power. 1. Hereditary principalities. Hereditary principalities are those that are transmitted within a family from generation to generation. These principalities are usually easier to govern because the dynasty is already established, and the loyalty of the subjects to the ruling family is maintained over time. According to Machiavelli, the prince who inherits a hereditary principality has the advantage of continuity and of being seen as the legitimate successor, which reduces resistance to change. Despite the stability that a hereditary principality can offer, Machiavelli warns that the hereditary prince cannot rest on his laurels. You must still be wise in managing power, as political, social, or economic changes can threaten even the most established dynasties. For example, if a crown prince fails to meet the expectations of his people or acts in a despotic manner, he may lose popular support and, with it, his power. 2. New principalities. New principalities, on the other hand, are those that are not tied to a hereditary dynasty and that are acquired through personal effort, conquest, cunning, or inheritance by other non-direct means. These principalities are much more difficult to govern, since the prince who acquires them must consolidate his power and win the loyalty of the people and the nobility that was already established in the territory. The new principalities present a significant challenge, as the new prince must face resistance from both those who already ruled the land and those who fear that the new social or political order will strip them of their privileges. In addition, new princes must create a legitimacy that allows them to maintain power, often in the face of internal opposition or external aggression. Machiavelli explains that new princes must be very shrewd and determined, as they must take advantage of circumstances to their advantage. In addition, they must be able to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, using cunning and strategic alliances to consolidate their power. The examples that Machiavelli mentions are Cesare Borgia, who used his intelligence and calculated cruelty to establish a dominion over the territories he conquered. 3. Mixed principalities. Mixed principalities are a combination of the previous two. A prince conquers new lands that are connected to an inherited or already established principality. This type of principality has two dimensions to handle: the heritage of the already existing region and the new conquest, which presents a double challenge. The prince must not only maintain stability in the inherited territories, but also integrate the population of the new lands, winning their loyalty and avoiding resistance. Machiavelli considers that mixed principalities are among the most difficult to maintain. The prince must deal with new populations and new political structures that do not always accept the new ruler. To consolidate its power, it must act quickly and face resistance from local forces seeking to regain independence. The way of governing mixed principalities depends, according to Machiavelli, on the nature of the change and on the ability of the prince to win over the people of the new regions. Success in this type of principality lies in a combination of strength and wisdom. The mixed principality and long-term stability. Machiavelli devotes special attention to mixed principalities, as he considers these to be the ones that present the greatest challenges, but also offer great opportunities if handled properly. The key for the prince of a mixed principality is to maintain control over both new and existing regions. This implies a wise management of alliances, an adequate distribution of resources, and the ability to neutralize possible internal threats. The author points out that, in practice, many princes who have obtained new territories through conquest or alliances fail to maintain power, as they fail to effectively integrate the population of the new lands. Therefore, cultural and political adaptation plays a fundamental role, and the prince must be flexible to establish systems of government that do not clash with local customs. The importance of the prince's strength and cunning. In summary, this chapter illustrates that the type of principality a prince manages directly influences the governance strategy he must apply. A hereditary principality provides stability and continuity, but the prince must maintain a good relationship with his people to avoid discontent. A new principality requires unparalleled cunning and aggressiveness to consolidate and secure its legitimacy, while a mixed principality presents the challenge of integrating new lands and managing diverse populations. Machiavelli concludes this chapter by emphasizing that the ability to adapt and the willingness to be cunning are the essential characteristics that a prince must possess to run any type of principality successfully. By keeping this in mind, the prince can ensure that he not only retains his power, but expands it successfully in the long term. This chapter lays the foundation for how a prince should evaluate the type of principality he is dealing with and what strategies he should employ accordingly. Each type of principality comes with its own advantages and disadvantages, but ultimately success depends on the prince's ability to adapt and make smart decisions as he faces the complexities of power. Chapter 3. The hereditary principalities. In this chapter, Niccolò Machiavelli focuses on hereditary principalities, those that are inherited from generation to generation within a family. According to Machiavelli, this type of principality has certain inherent advantages that make it easier to maintain compared to other types of principalities, although it is not without its challenges. The prince who inherits a domain has an established power base, but must work intelligently to maintain the loyalty of his people and prevent circumstances from changing. Advantages of hereditary principalities. Machiavelli points out that one of the key principles for a hereditary prince is that the people are already accustomed to his rule. This creates a solid foundation of legitimacy and loyalty that makes it easier to maintain power. Over the centuries, the hereditary prince does not need to gain the support of the people as intensely as a new prince, since the inheritance of his title implies a tacit acceptance of his authority. In a hereditary principality, the prince benefits from a political tradition that supports his rule, and the ruling family has consolidated authority. This means that the problems that can arise with internal resistance or popular revolutions are much less frequent, as the ruling family has established deep ties with the population, often through generations of governance. Stability in a hereditary principality. Political stability in a hereditary principality is one of the great benefits that Machiavelli highlights. As the rulers of a family are accepted as legitimate, they have the ability to rule without great difficulty. continuity in government, and the fact that inherited princes are seen as part of the social structure makes the transition of power within a royal family more fluid. However, despite this initial stability, Machiavelli warns that inherited princes must maintain a good relationship with their subjects. Although the principle of inheritance gives the prince a privileged status, the people do not always remain loyal out of obligation. If a prince acts oppressively, negligently, or despotically, even a hereditary principality can face revolt or even loss of power. The key to a hereditary prince is to stay close to his people and rule wisely. The wisdom of inherited princes. A hereditary prince, unlike a new prince, does not need to prove his skill in acquiring power, but he must constantly work to maintain it. If a hereditary prince is wise and acts prudently, he can enjoy a long and prosperous reign, as popular support and internal stability are usually assured. However, complacency or lack of capacity can be fatal. The inherited prince must be able to adapt to the changes that occur in his time, even if these changes are political, social, or economic. The importance of the public image. Machiavelli stresses that an inherited prince must be very careful with his public image. While his legitimacy comes from inheritance, he must be able to earn the respect of his people. This not only involves good governance practices, but also the ability to create a figure that inspires trust and admiration. An inherited prince who is seen as incapable or indifferent to the needs of his people risks losing the respect and loyalty that are essential to maintaining power. In addition, the inherited prince must remember that times change. While the basic principles of governance may remain constant, the expectations and circumstances that define society evolve. An inherited prince who gets stuck in old practices or ignores new social realities can quickly be overwhelmed by popular movements or structural changes. The effect of heredity on power. Inheritance offers princes a strategic advantage, but this advantage can also be a double-edged sword. Although the inherited prince has a solid starting point, this alone does not guarantee his permanence in power if he does not know how to adapt to the new circumstances. The inherited prince must have the wisdom to adjust his policy to the changing demands of society, as well as maintain a respectable image and not lose favor with the people. Machiavelli stresses that, to be a successful prince, the key is not only hereditary status, but the ability to govern within changing circumstances. A crown prince who forgives his enemies or is overly lenient could end up losing moral and political authority, especially if his governance becomes weak or ineffective. The example of hereditary princes in history to illustrate his point, Machiavelli draws on several historical examples of hereditary princes who successfully maintained power or lost dominance due to their failure to handle the proper circumstances. The ruling families that have endured in history are those that have been able to adapt to changes, remain vigilant in the face of challenges, and make brave decisions when situations demanded it. Among the most important examples that Machiavelli mentions include Lewis and military force. Conclusion of the chapter. This chapter concludes by reaffirming that, although hereditary principalities have the advantage of continuity, the princes who rule them must not let their guard down. Wisdom and adaptability remain essential to maintaining power. The key for a crown prince is to be prudent, maintain a good relationship with the people, and be prepared to adapt to changes so that his dynasty continues to prosper. In short, the crown prince faces fewer immediate risks than a new prince, but must continually work to maintain his legitimacy, properly manage the expectations of his people, and adapt to social changes that could threaten his reign. Wisdom and attention to detail are essential for long-term success. Chapter 4. The mixed principalities. In this chapter, Niccolò Machiavelli addresses mixed principalities, those obtained through the conquest or union of territories of an inherited principality and a newly acquired one. Machiavelli argues that these are the most difficult types of principalities to maintain, due to the multiple challenges faced by both the new ruler and the subjects of the new lands. This chapter offers a detailed look at how a prince should handle the situation when he inherits or acquires a new territory that has its own political, social, or cultural identity. The difficulty of maintaining a mixed principality. Machiavelli points out that, unlike hereditary principalities, In mixed principalities, the prince has to face internal resistance from the newly conquered populations. The main difficulty lies in gaining the loyalty of new lands that are not accustomed to their governance. The prince is often challenged by those who wish to regain their autonomy or who oppose the new imposed order. The cultural, social, and economic difference between the old and new lands means that the ruler has to adapt quickly to consolidate his power in the newly acquired territory. Machiavelli considers that if a prince does not correctly handle these differences, he could face a popular revolt or lose the acquired lands. The importance of strength and wisdom. The prince who rules a mixed principality must act quickly and decisively, since the consolidation of his power depends on how he manages to dominate the new regions. If the prince shows weakness or uncertainty, the people will be tempted to rebel, seeking to regain control of their old power structures. Machiavelli emphasizes that speed and firmness are essential to ensure dominance. The prince must impose his authority immediately, without hesitation. However, the author also highlights the importance of wisdom in governance. A prince must not act only through force, but must apply strategy and cunning to gain the support of the local population. This can be achieved through alliances, political reforms, and sometimes using diplomacy and control of key resources. The integration of nuevas terras. The case of Caesar Borgia. Machiavelli uses the example of Caesar Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, to illustrate how a prince can manage a mixed principality. Caesar Borgia inherited part of his family's power and also acquired new territories in Italy. Despite his political and military skills, Machiavelli argues that the lack of popular support and unforeseen political changes in the church meant that he was unable to fully consolidate his rule. The case of Caesar Borgia demonstrates that, to maintain a mixed principality, the prince must ensure that the new regions integrate well with the rest of his domain, without creating resentments between the original inhabitants. Despite Caesar's cunning and ability to make quick decisions, the political circumstances of the time did not allow him to permanently consolidate his power. Local resistance and the need to impose power. One of the key points Machiavelli addresses in this chapter is that local resistances are almost inevitable in mixed principalities. The people of the conquered lands have a strong attachment to their customs and traditional leaders, which can make it difficult for the new prince to consolidate power. Machiavelli emphasizes that rebellion is the greatest threat facing a prince who has acquired new lands. In this sense, the author suggests that the prince must act quickly to eliminate any source of resistance. Complete control of the territory depends not only on military force, but also on an effective integration policy, which includes cultural tolerance, political reforms that favor local elites, and persuasion strategies to gain the support of the population. However, Machiavelli also emphasizes that, when necessary, the prince must be ruthless toward those who challenge his power. The mixed principality and the manipulation of fortune. One of the central ideas that Machiavelli introduces in this chapter is the role of fortune, luck, in the consolidation of a mixed principality. Although the prince must be virtuous in terms of skill, cunning, and bravery, he must also be able to take advantage of opportunities that present themselves favorably. The concept of fortune in Machiavelli's work refers to external and unpredictable factors that can affect the course of events. The prince who inherits a mixed principality must be prepared to take advantage of favorable circumstances and adapt quickly to changes in his environment. This involves knowing how to manage international relations, adjust domestic policies, and take advantage of moments of weakness in your enemies. Integration strategies. Controlling the nobility and the people to consolidate his power, the prince must apply integration strategies that ensure the loyalty of the local nobility and the common people. Machiavelli suggests that rewarding the nobility who support the prince, as well as granting certain privileges to the lower classes, is crucial to preventing new uprisings from arising. However, you must also prevent a powerful class from becoming too independent or competitive, which could challenge your power. Social cohesion is essential, and the prince must actively work to avoid creating internal divisions that can be exploited by those seeking to replace former rulers. To do this, the prince can gain allies within traditional structures and ensure that the new administration is integrated without completely upsetting the existing social order. Conclusion of the chapter. The chapter concludes by highlighting the complexity of managing a mixed principality. While it may offer great opportunities to expand a prince's power, the challenges of integration, resistance, and legitimation are considerable. Princes must be fast, cunning, and always maintain a flexible strategy that allows them to adapt to the reality of the terrain. The combination of strength and wisdom is the key to ensuring that the mixed principality becomes a stable and enduring dominion. This chapter highlights the difficulties inherent in acquiring a mixed principality and offers a clear view of the methods a prince must use to consolidate his power. Machiavelli reminds us that, in politics, there is no room for complacency. Constant adaptation and strategic management are essential for the ruler's survival in a changing and challenging context. Chapter 5. Governing Liberal Cities and States. In this chapter, Niccolò Machiavelli examines the strategies that a prince must adopt to govern cities that have a tradition of freedom, that is, those in which the people have experienced political autonomy or self-government. Machiavelli recognizes that governing a territory that has previously enjoyed freedom presents significant difficulties, as the inhabitants are not accustomed to absolute obedience and tend to rebel when a prince attempts to impose his rule. The nature of liberal cities are those in which the people have a tradition of freedom and have enjoyed self-government, as in the Italian city-states that existed in the time of Machiavelli. In these places, people are used to making collective decisions and having control over their own affairs. As a prince attempts to take control, he faces some resistance as the population is unwilling to give up their independence without a fight. Machiavelli observes that the inhabitants of these cities have a deep aversion to any form of government that deprives them of their liberties. The mentality of people who have lived in a free city means that a prince has to take very careful approaches to ensure that his rule is accepted. Strategies to govern liberal cities. Machiavelli offers some strategies for the prince to successfully govern these cities. Firstly, he maintains that the key to success is maintaining stability and social peace within the city. If the prince comes with an aggressive approach, he is likely to face immediate resistance. Rather than imposing power directly, the prince must seek the approval or at least the cooperation of key groups within the city. One of the strategies that Machiavelli recommends is to create alliances with local factions. These factions can be nobles, merchants, warriors, or even religious leaders. By strengthening these alliances, the prince can consolidate his power without having to resort to overt repression. It is crucial, according to Machiavelli, to ensure that local elites do not feel displaced, but can share some power with the prince, ensuring their loyalty and cooperation. Furthermore, the prince must act strategically to ensure that citizens do not feel that their freedom has been suppressed. He may allow some local institutions to continue functioning as long as they do not pose a direct threat to the prince's power. That is, you must maintain certain traditions that give them a feeling of autonomy, but under your absolute control. The use of force and justified cruelty. Machiavelli also mentions that, although in principle the prince must be prudent and not use force immediately, there are times when severity is required. When faced with persistent resistance or revolt, the prince must be decisive and use force if necessary to put down the rebellion. In this context, Machiavelli introduces the concept of cruelty well used. A prince should use cruelty only when absolutely necessary and quickly, and decisive, so that people understand that the prince will not tolerate disobedience. However, cruelty must be limited in time and applied in such a way that it does not become constant abuse that generates popular resentment. Machiavelli makes the distinction between cruelty well used and cruelty badly used. Well-used cruelty is carried out quickly and in critical situations to quickly eliminate any resistance, while poorly used cruelty is prolonged and generates distrust and hatred among the people. Historical examples of rulers of liberal cities. The author uses several historical examples of rulers who attempted to take control of free cities and the strategies they employed. He mentions figures such as Cesare Borgia, who used a combination of cunning, force, and diplomacy to consolidate his power in conquered territories, and Ferdinand the Catholic of Spain, who consolidated power through a gradual and strategic process that involved local elites and promoted a feeling of unity within the territories he governed. Machiavelli also highlights that, in many cases, the failure of rulers when trying to conquer liberal cities is due to the lack of ability to manage the emotions and expectations of the people. The constant resistance of free cities to central authority is a challenge that requires a cunning prince, capable of attempting to gain popular favor while reinforcing absolute control. The relationship with local traditions. Another crucial aspect that Machiavelli analyzes is the relationship between the prince and local traditions. A prince who rules a mixed principality or a city with a long tradition of freedom must be able to recognize the importance of local customs. Ignoring these traditions can lead to unnecessary conflict and jeopardize the stability of the prince's power. Therefore, an intelligent prince must know when to adapt to cultural expectations without losing sight of the need to consolidate his own power. The wisdom and prudence of the prince. Finally, Machiavelli concludes that success in the governance of free cities depends largely on the wisdom and prudence of a prince. Through political astuteness, the ability to adapt to circumstances, and the ability to build alliances, the prince can secure his power, even in territories where freedom and independence are deeply rooted characteristics of the population. The ideal prince will be one who is flexible, capable of correctly interpreting the wishes of the people, but without completely yielding to popular control. This chapter highlights the complexities involved in governing a free city or a territory with a tradition of self-government. Machiavelli offers a governance strategy based on the balance between adaptation to local customs and the consolidation of centralized power. The key for a prince in this situation is to know when to be flexible and when to impose his authority, ensuring political stability without alienating the people. Chapter 6. Fortune and Virtue. In this chapter, Niccolò Machiavelli examines two key concepts that influence a prince's success: fortune and virtue. These concepts are presented as opposite but complementary forces that determine the destiny of the rulers. Machiavelli argues that although fortune plays an important role in a prince's destiny, it is virtue, understood as the ability and character of the ruler, that ultimately allows him to control his destiny. Fortune as an uncontrollable force. Machiavelli defines fortune as luck or external factors that influence life events and are outside the control of the individual. Fortune represents the unpredictable circumstances and conditions that can benefit or harm the prince on his path to power. According to Machiavelli, fortune is presented as a capricious force, which can favor or destroy without warning, generating uncertainty in politics and government. However, Machiavelli does not see fortune as something completely uncontrolled. In his vision, fortune has its own pattern, and therefore princes must be able to adapt to it. Although fortune cannot be completely foreseen, the wise prince must be prepared to take advantage of the opportunities that come his way and minimize the negative effects when luck turns adverse. Virtue as the ability to take advantage of fortune. On the other hand, virtue refers to the prince's internal ability to face challenges and make wise decisions that allow him to control his destiny. Machiavelli defines virtue as a combination of skill, cunning, and courage to adapt to circumstances, whether favorable or unfavorable. A virtuous prince is capable of acting with determination, using his intelligence and judgment to transform situations in his favor. Virtue, in Machiavelli's context, has nothing to do with traditional morality or religious ethics. Instead, virtue refers to the prince's ability to act effectively in an unpredictable and dangerous world. The virtuous prince is one who knows how to adjust his behavior according to circumstances and who is willing to use all available means, even the most unorthodox, to achieve and maintain power. Fortune and virtue. The balance between luck and skill. For Machiavelli, both fortune and virtue are essential to the success of a prince. Although fortune is an uncontrollable force, the prince must have the virtue necessary to navigate the changing waters of politics. A prince who has virtue can take advantage of the opportunities that fortune offers him, while one who lacks it will be unable to take advantage of even the best of circumstances. A good example of this is Cesar Borgia, who, despite the ups and downs of fortune, showed remarkable virtue in handling difficult situations, such as when he managed to recover the control over his territory after a series of initial failures. According to Machiavelli, although fortune played a major role in his success, It was his personal skill and strategic decisions that enabled him to overcome adversity and consolidate his power. Fortune in times of peace and war. Machiavelli makes an important distinction between fortune in times of peace and in times of war. In times of peace, fortune has more freedom of action, and external factors are more likely to affect the prince's well-being. In contrast, in times of war, the prince has more control over circumstances, since decisive action and military strategy can subordinate external influences. A prince must be able to prepare for war in times of peace by maintaining a strong army and a clear view of international politics. In this way, when fortune tests him with an unexpected war, the prince will be in a position to seize the opportunity and maintain control. Strategic wisdom is therefore one of the essential components of virtue that a prince must cultivate. The example of great leaders. Machiavelli offers historical examples to illustrate how great leaders were able to balance fortune and virtue. Alexander the Great, for example, was a leader who displayed great virtue by using his military and strategic skill to conquer vast territories. Although fortune played a major role in his expansion, it was his personal ability to overcome obstacles and take advantage of every opportunity that truly consolidated his empire. However, Machiavelli also points out that not all leaders were equally fortunate. Louis XII of France, for example, had several failures during his reign, despite his skills as a leader. Fortune was not on his side, and Machiavelli mentions how unfavorable circumstances contributed to his downfall. Fortune as something to be tamed. Ultimately, Machiavelli concludes that fortune is a force that cannot be completely controlled, but can be tamed through virtue. A prince must learn to navigate fortune wisely, adapting to circumstances and taking advantage of every opportunity. The key is to prepare for the unexpected and be flexible and decisive enough to act when circumstances demand it. Chapter 7. The role of the army in power. In this chapter, Niccolò Machiavelli underlines the crucial importance of a strong army for a prince seeking to consolidate and maintain power. For Machiavelli, the army is not only a tool of defense, but also an essential instrument for meeting political challenges, protecting territory, and ultimately ensuring the stability of the principality. This chapter highlights how the prince must be intimately linked to his army and how his success in politics depends on the loyalty and competence of his forces. Military force as a base of power. Machiavelli begins the chapter by explaining that a prince cannot rely solely on his allies or foreign forces to protect his kingdom. Although alliances and diplomatic relations are important, the autonomy and security of a principality depend largely on its own loyal and efficient army. According to Machiavelli, a prince who depends on mercenaries or outside troops is in a vulnerable position, since these soldiers do not have the commitment and loyalty necessary to defend the state with determination. Mercenaries, for Machiavelli, are dangerous because they are disloyal, they fight only for money and, therefore, their fidelity is not assured. In the event that the situation becomes difficult, the mercenaries may abandon the battlefield or even betray the prince. Furthermore, since they are not emotionally invested in the fate of the principality, they do not fight with the same determination as a national army. The national armies and popular loyalty, on the other hand, national armies are those formed by citizens of the same principality. Machiavelli highlights that these soldiers, being part of the same society, have a feeling of belonging and a natural loyalty towards the prince and his nation. National armies are much more effective because soldiers are willing to fight for their land and community, rather than just for financial compensation. The prince must be able to create a solid military force based on the loyalty of his troops. To do this, he must offer incentives to his soldiers, whether material rewards, honors, or titles, so that each member of the army sees the benefit of their commitment to the defense of the principality. Machiavelli also suggests that the prince should integrate the population through basic military training that allows, if necessary, to have a large and prepared army in record time. The need to train the army, according to Machiavelli, must be constantly trained to stay in shape and prepared for any eventuality. Discipline and training are essential for the army to function as a cohesive unit. It is not enough to have soldiers. It is crucial that these soldiers are prepared and trained to act efficiently under pressure. Machiavelli considers preparation and practice essential and recommends that the prince maintain constant training and continuous training for his troops so that they are always ready to defend the principality from any threat. This is especially important in peacetime, when national armies can become lazy and vulnerable if they are not kept active and well-trained. The prince's military leadership. The prince, according to Machiavelli, must have a close and direct relationship with his army. Not only is it important for the prince to have a loyal army, but he must earn the trust of his troops and be an exemplary leader. The prince cannot completely delegate military command, but must be an active commander, personally involved in military decisions and showing courage on the battlefield. The prince's presence in campaigns not only inspires respect, but also reinforces his authority and leadership. Machiavelli also mentions that the prince must be prepared for war in peacetime, as war can break out at any time, and a prince without a strong army in peacetime will be vulnerable when conflicts arise. The importance of armies in expansion and defense. The author emphasizes that a prince must have a strong and well-trained army not only to defend himself, but also to expand his territory if he wishes. Without a competent army, any attempt at territorial expansion will be ineffective and dangerous, as it will be at the mercy of external forces and internal enemies. On the other hand, Machiavelli emphasizes that control of the army is not sufficient on its own. The prince must also maintain the high morale and commitment of his troops. A strong but unmotivated army does not have the power necessary to achieve decisive victories. Therefore, the prince must be wise in managing the expectations and needs of his army. The example of great leaders. To illustrate the importance of the army and power, Machiavelli offers several historical examples of princes who maintain their power thanks to a strong and loyal army. Caesar Borgia is one of the most prominent examples. Although Borgia used mercenaries on some occasions, he also organized a loyal national army that played a crucial role in his attempt to consolidate power in the territories he had conquered. Machiavelli also notes that some princes have managed to maintain power not only through military force, but also by using astute diplomacy that reinforces their allies and minimizes external threats while maintaining a formidable military presence. Conclusion of the chapter. The chapter concludes by highlighting that a strong army is essential to the success of a prince, since the security and expansion of the principality depend directly on military strength. However, Machiavelli emphasizes that it is not enough to have troops. The prince must be a wise leader who wins the loyalty of his soldiers, keeps morale high, and trains his troops consistently. The prince must be an active commander, involved in strategic decisions, and have a direct relationship with his army to ensure that it is prepared to defend and expand his territory, thus ensuring the stability and durability of his domain. This chapter highlights the central role of the army not only as a defense tool, but as an indispensable base of power. Machiavelli teaches that a prince who wants to maintain power must ensure that his army is composed of loyal troops, well-trained and willing to fight for his cause. Without this military force, a prince will not be able to maintain control or defend his territory in times of war. Chapter 8. Religion as an instrument of power. In this chapter, Niccolò Machiavelli addresses religion as a strategic tool that a prince can use to consolidate his power and gain the loyalty of his people. Throughout his work, Machiavelli considers religion as a fundamental political power, like military force and diplomatic alliances. This chapter explores how the prince can effectively manipulate and use religion to legitimize his authority and unite his people under his rule. Religion as a tool of control. Machiavelli begins by highlighting that religion has immense power over people's minds, since religious beliefs are capable of shaping the attitudes and behaviors of individuals. An intelligent prince must recognize the symbolic power of religion and learn to use it to his advantage. Religion can serve as an instrument of social control by providing rulers with a moral justification for their actions and policies. According to Machiavelli, religion is useful in strengthening the authority of the prince, since people, seeing the prince as chosen by God or as the representative of a divine will be more willing to accept his rule without questioning it. Additionally, the prince can use religion to foster unity and solidarity within his kingdom, promoting common values and shared moralities. Religion as a moral refuge. Machiavelli also mentions that religion can serve as a moral refuge for the prince, especially when he must make difficult or unpopular decisions. By aligning himself with religious doctrines or presenting himself as a ruler acting in the name of divine principles, the prince can justify his actions, even if they are harsh or controversial. In this way, he can disguise any act of cruelty or violence under the veil of religious morality. In this sense, Machiavelli mentions that the public image of the prince can be strengthened by his link with religion, since piety and religious devotion tend to generate respectability and admiration. In many cases, the prince may use religion as a means of avoiding guilt for complicated political decisions, attributing the authority of his actions to a higher will. The use of religion to unify the nation. One of the most relevant points that Machiavelli raises in this chapter is the ability of religion to unify the population of a principality. In a diverse society in the face of many different beliefs and traditions, a prince can use religion as a means of establishing a common faith, which fosters social cohesion and reduces internal divisions. Machiavelli observes that religion can be used as a social glue that binds people together, as shared beliefs tend to minimize differences and increase the sense of belonging to a community. This is especially important when a prince has to rule a diverse or newly conquered territory, where local identities and traditional loyalties may be an obstacle to consolidating power. By using religion strategically, the prince can reduce internal conflict and strengthen the unity of the principality. Religion and politics. A strategic balance. Despite the positive influence of religion, Machiavelli warns that the prince must be cautious in using it. Religion is powerful, but it can also be dangerous if overly manipulated or inappropriately undermined. If the prince were to lose credibility in his ties to religion, he could lose popular support and weaken his authority. The prince must therefore carefully balance his relationship with religion. He must neither be overly devout nor overly skeptical, but must strike a balance between the display of piety and the pragmatic handling of religious institutions. The prince must ally himself with the church when convenient and keep it in check when necessary, preventing religious institutions from gaining too much political power. Machiavelli's role in politics devotes a portion of this chapter to examining the role of the Catholic Church in the politics of his time. He notes that the church has immense power, not only in spiritual terms, but also political ones. Princes, in this context, must maintain good relations with the church, as the religious legitimization of their rule can be a source of stability. However, the prince must also be prepared to keep the church in check and prevent it from becoming a political rival. Machiavelli mentions that intelligent princes must not only be religious in order to win popular approval, but must also understand the role of the church as an institution with interests of its own. The prince must know how to play religious politics to his advantage, while maintaining prudent control over the church to prevent its powers from interfering with his own. Religion and the character of the prince. Finally, Machiavelli stresses that religion not only benefits the prince from an external point of view, in terms of political control, but also from an internal point of view. Religion can provide the prince with a moral foundation that enables him to remain calm and serene in the face of the difficulties of government. Furthermore, religion can also serve as a means of motivation for the prince and his people, giving them a sense of common purpose and a transcendental goal. By acting in accordance with religious principles, the prince can strengthen his authority, gain popular loyalty, and ensure moral legitimacy to support his governance. Conclusion of the chapter. Machiavelli concludes this chapter by emphasizing that religion is one of the most powerful tools a prince can use to consolidate his power. Although the manipulation of religion must be done with wisdom and prudence, there is no doubt that religion provides the prince with symbolic power, an instrument of social control, and a solid moral foundation on which to build his legitimacy. The prince must use religion shrewdly, recognizing its power, but also preventing it from becoming an obstacle to his own power. With correct management, religion can become an essential tool to unify the population, justify political decisions, and strengthen its control over the principality. Chapter 9. The prince's advice. And advice in this chapter Niccolò Machiavelli highlights the importance of advisors for a prince, highlighting that a good prince must surround himself with wise people who can offer strategic and practical advice in making decisions. However, Machiavelli also warns of the dangers of blindly trusting advisors and the need for the prince to maintain his own judgment and wisdom. This chapter explores how the prince should select and use his advisors effectively to maximize his success. The importance of wise advice. Machiavelli begins by stating that a good prince depends not only on his own skill and intelligence, but also on the advice of those around him. In this sense, advisors are crucial because they help the prince make informed decisions and avoid serious mistakes that could cost him his power. The prince must be able to recognize that, although he himself may have the necessary wisdom, it is often more effective to consult with people who have experience in specific areas such as war, diplomacy, and domestic politics. Machiavelli also recognizes that advisors are not only technical experts, but also those who are in tune with the interests and needs of the prince. A good advisor must be someone who understands the circumstances in which the principality finds itself and who offers strategic solutions based on a deep understanding of the political context. The selection of directors. Wisdom and loyalty. One of the key points that Machiavelli addresses in this chapter is the proper selection of advisors. The prince should not choose his advisors only for their intellectual ability or experience, but also for their loyalty and commitment to the principality. Machiavelli emphasizes that a prince must be very careful not to surround himself with disloyal or ambitious individuals who might betray him in the future. The prince must ensure that the advisors are honest and willing to act in his best interest, not just their own. However, Machiavelli also warns that the prince must not be overly trusting of the advisors, as, although loyal, all advisors have their own agendas. It is vital that the prince always maintain control over his decisions and not allow the advisors to influence the course of the principality too much. The prince's role in decision-making. While advisors are important, Machiavelli emphasizes that the prince must never completely delegate the power of decision-making. Despite receiving advice, the prince must always be the one to make the final decision. A prince's ability to listen to his advisors and decide wisely is what will determine his success. Machiavelli argues that a prince who relies too much on his advisors risks losing control over the principality, as the advisors can manipulate decisions to benefit their own interests. Therefore, the prince must be wise in choosing which advice to follow and which to reject, while always maintaining his independence of judgment. The prince and conflicting advice. An important aspect that Machiavelli mentions is that advisors will often offer conflicting opinions. In these cases, the prince must carefully evaluate each option, taking into account the motives of each advisor and the political situation at the time. It is critical that the prince not be swayed by the easiest or most popular advice, but rather take the time to consider all the implications before making a decision. Machiavelli also suggests that the prince should encourage diversity of opinions among his advisors, which will allow him to gain a more complete view of the problems he faces. However, it is vital that the prince avoid falling into indecision by listening to too much conflicting advice. The prince must be able to filter information and make quick, decisive decisions. The wisdom of counselors. Necessary qualities. Machiavelli highlights some qualities that ideal counselors must have in order to be effective. First, they must be wise and experienced in their areas of expertise. They must also be honest and loyal, with no hidden interests or personal agendas interfering in the politics of the principality. Furthermore, they must be courageous, able to offer difficult advice when necessary, and not afraid to speak the truth even though it may be unpopular. Practical wisdom is more important than theoretical wisdom in this context, as a good counselor must have a deep understanding of power dynamics and know how to use their skills, how to apply their knowledge in concrete situations. That is, the best advisors are those who not only possess theory but also have a great deal of practical experience in solving real political problems. The prince must be the decisive leader. Machiavelli concludes this chapter by reiterating that the prince must be the decisive leader and not allow himself to be manipulated by his advisors. Although wise advisors are essential, the prince must always maintain absolute control over key decisions. A prince who completely delegates his authority to others runs the risk of losing his power and becoming a puppet of his own advisors. The prince must listen to his advisors, but in the end, he must be the one to make decisions based on his personal wisdom and strategic vision. Through this ability to discern the best advice and apply independent judgment, the prince can consolidate his power and ensure the stability of his government. Chapter conclusion. In conclusion, the role of advisors is fundamental for a prince, but they should not be the only source of power or decision. The prince must be shrewd, wise, and able to use advice to his advantage, while maintaining full control over the fate of the principality. The prince's wisdom in selecting and using his advisors, along with his ability to make informed decisions, are the keys to lasting success and political stability. This chapter reinforces the importance of autonomous leadership and the prince's critical ability to make strategic decisions in a world filled with misinformation, competing interests, and external pressures. Chapter 10. Cruelty and Mercy in Government. In this chapter, Niccolò Machiavelli analyzes the relationship between cruelty and mercy in government, a central theme in his work as it addresses the difficult decisions a prince must make in order to maintain power and ensure the stability of his principality. Machiavelli reflects on when it is appropriate to use cruelty and when mercy is the more appropriate option. The key, according to the author, is to balance both pragmatically and strategically so as not to lose popular support or compromise authority. Justified cruelty. When and how to use it. Machiavelli begins the chapter by acknowledging that cruelty is a tool that every prince must consider, especially in difficult circumstances. Although cruelty is generally seen as a negative thing in politics, Machiavelli suggests that, if used correctly, it can be an effective strategy for maintaining order and stability in a principality. The author makes a distinction between well-used cruelty and bad cruelty. Well-used cruelty is cruelty that is carried out quickly and decisively in order to effectively eliminate threats, without lingering or causing lasting resentment among the population. When cruelty is used in a calculated manner, it can serve to dismantle enemies, eliminate possible traitors, and send a clear message that the prince will not tolerate disobedience. A good example of cruelty well used is the way Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, managed his territories. At certain times, Borgia made drastic decisions to ensure his control over the cities he had conquered, eliminating rivals quickly. Although some considered his methods cruel, Machiavelli argues that his efficiency in acting firmly allowed his dominions to solidify quickly. Cruelty misused. The risks of excessiveness, on the other hand. Misused cruelty occurs when a prince resorts to unnecessary violence or perpetuates suffering among his people, leading to resentment and rebellion. Machiavelli warns that excessive cruelty or tyranny can cause a prince to lose popular support, endangering his legitimacy and stability. In this sense, cruelty must be limited in time and space, and must not become a common practice. An example of bad cruelty would be the case of Ferdinand of Aragon, who, despite being successful in his reign, used excessively harsh methods in some of his conquests, generating popular discontent that compromised the legacy of his government. Machiavelli points out that, although a prince can resort to force in critical situations, its abuse can undermine his power and leave a bitter taste in the collective memory of the people. Mercy. A counterpoint to cruelty. In contrast to cruelty, Machiavelli also discusses the concept of mercy. Mercy is, according to the author, a principle that can strengthen the rule of a prince, as long as it is used in the right circumstances. A prince who is benevolent and generous can gain appreciation and loyalty among his people, making him more respected and supported by the majority. However, Machiavelli emphasizes that mercy should not be an absolute principle. A prince who constantly forgives his enemies or closes his eyes to disobedience may lose the authority and respect of his subjects. It is important to maintain a balance between mercy and firmness, ensuring that clemency is not perceived as weakness. The strategic use of mercy. Strategic mercy is used when a prince wants to gain the favor of his people or ensure that his actions are seen as just. For example, after taking control of a city, the prince may choose to forgive those who have rebelled, promote reforms, or ensure fair treatment for those who were previously oppressed. By doing this, the prince can get the population to view his rule as legitimate and compassionate, reducing the possibility of further rebellion or disloyalty. However, Machiavelli emphasizes that the prince should not indulge in excesses of mercy, since this type of compassion can be interpreted as ineffective or weakness. The key is to use mercy selectively, giving the people what they need to maintain peace, without giving up too much or losing authority. Balancing cruelty and mercy. The ideal prince, according to Machiavelli, is one who knows when to use cruelty to eliminate threats quickly and decisively, and when to be merciful to gain popular support and ensure long-term political stability. The ability to balance these two approaches is essential to the preservation of power. Furthermore, a good prince must be able to modify his approach depending on the circumstances. In times of crisis or war, cruelty may be necessary, while in times of peace and stability, mercy may play a more prominent role in reinforcing its legitimacy and social cohesion. Conclusion of the chapter. Machiavelli concludes this chapter by saying that while cruelty is a useful tool for the prince, it must be calculated and temporary, while mercy can be a long-term strategy to consolidate power and maintain popular control. A prince must act with prudence, knowing when to use force and when to apply compassion, always with the goal of maintaining stability and strengthening his rule. The successful prince is not one who exaggerates cruelty or mercy, but rather one who knows when and how to apply each of these principles to maximize his power and guarantee the loyalty of his people. The right balance between these two factors is therefore a key political skill for a stable and long-lasting government. Chapter 11. The Prince and Recklessness. In this chapter, Niccolò Machiavelli addresses the issue of imprudence in political decision-making. Throughout his work, Machiavelli defends the idea that a prince must be a calculating and prudent leader, making decisions based on reason and strategy, and not being carried away by impulses or emotions. However, he recognizes that despite his efforts to be wise and rational, even the most prudent princes can make fatal mistakes if they do not handle unforeseen factors well. Imprudence and its consequences. Machiavelli begins the chapter by highlighting that recklessness is one of the greatest threats to the stability of a principality. A prince who acts impulsively or without considering all the consequences can endanger his power and the security of the state. Machiavelli observes that princes who fail in their governments often do so due to poorly made decisions, based on a lack of reflection or errors in judgment. Recklessness can lead a prince to commit foolish acts, such as attacking without proper preparation or failing to respond to threats when necessary. A prince. You must have the wisdom to recognize when to take risks and when to avoid hasty decisions that could harm the balance of your principality. The error of impatience. Acting without thinking. One of the most common errors that Machiavelli highlights is that of impatience. A prince who does not have the ability to wait for the right moment to act runs the risk of missing opportunities or even making decisions that destroy what he has achieved so far. Patience is an essential virtue for the prince, who must be able to wait for the right moment to act, without rushing into decisions that could endanger his reign. Machiavelli warns that recklessness often arises when a prince does not have the ability to read the signs of his environment or does not know when to adapt his strategy. Acting under pressure or getting carried away by momentary emotions can result in fatal mistakes. On the other hand, the prudent prince knows how to carefully evaluate situations before making decisions, always maintaining control of his impulses. Prudence in decision-making to avoid recklessness. Machiavelli advises that a prince should surround himself with wise advisors and listen to their advice carefully. However, the prince must also make the final decision based on his own judgment, ensuring that any action taken is aligned with the long-term interests of the principality. The prince must be thoughtful, calculating all possibilities and anticipating the consequences of his actions before acting. Furthermore, the prince must be cautious when making changes or reforms in his principality. Drastic changes can lead to resistance or instability. Therefore, you must evaluate the impact of your decisions thoroughly and ensure that you are in full control of the situation before making any risky moves. Recklessness in war and diplomacy. Machiavelli also discusses the relationship between recklessness and war decisions. A prince who enters conflict without adequate preparation, without a clear strategy, or without considering the long-term consequences is endangering not only his principality, but also his legacy. The most successful princes are those who make informed and strategic military decisions, avoiding unnecessary war and ensuring they have the advantage before engaging in combat. Regarding diplomacy, Machiavelli argues that recklessness can also arise when the prince rushes into international agreements without carefully evaluating the intentions of his allies or the risks of enemies. Diplomatic prudence is crucial, as a poorly managed alliance can weaken the principality or expose it to betrayal. Diplomacy must be approached with patience and strategy, always seeking what is most beneficial for the state in the long term. The example of great leaders. Machiavelli offers several historical examples to illustrate how recklessness has been the cause of the fall of great princes. One of the most notable examples is that of Louis XII of France, who, despite his initial successes, suffered a setback due to his lack of prudence in expanding too quickly and making unreliable alliances. In his case, military recklessness and hasty decision to engage in several military campaigns without a solid strategy resulted in failures that ultimately affected his power. Another example is that of Cesar Borgia, who, despite his political and military skill, made several errors in judgment that cost him control of some of his domains. Recklessness in his power management decisions and lack of foresight in his internal politics contributed to his downfall, despite his initial successes. The relationship between recklessness and fortune. Machiavelli also discusses how fortune, or luck, plays an important role in politics, but which the prudent prince can control in part through his calculated decisions. A prince who relies too much on fortune and does not make rational decisions can be overcome by events, while one who acts prudently can take advantage of the opportunities of fortune and avoid the risks of adversity. Thus, recklessness is often the result of not adequately preparing for unpredictable turns of fortune. Conclusion of the chapter. In conclusion, Machiavelli highlights that recklessness is a great danger for a prince, but that it can be avoided with a thoughtful and strategic attitude. The prince must be prudent in all his decisions, evaluating the consequences of his actions before taking any action. Wisdom and prudence in decision-making are essential to maintaining power, avoiding destabilization of the principality, and, in the long term, ensuring a successful reign. The prince must avoid falling into the trap of impulsiveness and instead take the time to reflect on his decisions and exercise his judgment clearly. This chapter reinforces the idea that effective leadership depends on the ability to make sensible and well-founded decisions, avoiding recklessness and always seeking the common good of the principality with a strategic and realistic approach. Chapter 12. The use of deception and manipulation. In this chapter, Niccolò Machiavelli addresses the use of deception and manipulation as tools of power for a prince. According to Machiavelli, in politics, truth and transparency are not always the ruler's best allies. Instead, a cunning prince must be willing to deceive and manipulate when necessary to consolidate his power and maintain the stability of the principality. Machiavelli defends the idea that political reality is an unpredictable terrain, where appearances and deceptive strategies can be more effective than honesty. Politics as a game of appearances. Machiavelli begins the chapter by stating that politics is, in many ways, a game of appearances. In a world full of competition and conflict, a prince cannot afford to be completely honest or direct, as this could jeopardize his power. According to Machiavelli, the prince must create a public image that inspires respect and fear, even if it does not always reflect his true character or intentions. The author points out that the true nature of leaders is often not fully known, and the public image they project is more important than their private behavior. Princes must be masters of manipulation and deception, using these resources to strengthen their power without their true intention being evident to others. The prince who acts cunningly can achieve his goals without his enemies realizing his true motivations. The use of deception in politics. Machiavelli discusses how a prince can use deception to manipulate his enemies and maintain his dominance over the principality. For the author, a wise prince understands that, in many cases, the truth does not serve to consolidate power. On the contrary, deceiving others, especially enemies, can be a very effective way to ensure the prince's survival and success. This deception can take many forms, such as falsifying intentions, hiding true plans, or creating false perceptions at court or among subjects. A good example of political deception is the use of false alliances or the creation of false rivalries between factions. The prince may foment disputes among his enemies or lie about his intentions to distract them and buy time. Machiavelli also mentions that sometimes princes must act against their nature, appearing to be kind and generous people when in reality they are determined and calculating in their rule. The manipulation of public opinion. Machiavelli also highlights that manipulating public opinion is a key tool for any prince. In times of crisis or conflict, the prince must be able to control the discourse that takes place in the principality. This means manipulating the information that reaches the people so that their actions are seen as legitimate and fair, even if they are not. The prince may use propaganda or media strategies, in his time, through public speakers or narratives, to shape the perception of his subjects and maintain popular support. He may even resort to manipulating religion or public morality to make his actions be seen as divine acts or beneficial to the common good, although in practice, those acts only seek to strengthen his control over the principality. Deception in international diplomacy. Diplomacy is also fertile ground for deception. Machiavelli suggests that a prince should lie to his allies and act contradictory when necessary. International alliances should not be based on absolute honesty, but on the interests of the principality. A prince who fully commits to an alliance or pact may be putting himself in a vulnerable position. Instead, the prince must be cunning and manipulate international relations to maximize benefits while minimizing risks. For example, the prince may betray an ally if this allows him to gain a strategic advantage or protect his interests. Through diplomatic cunning, the prince can deceive his enemies or other nations, creating the appearance of mutual trust while secretly acting to achieve his own ends. The case of Caesar Borgia and manipulation. A key example that Machiavelli uses to illustrate the use of deception and manipulation is that of Caesar Borgia, who, despite being a controversial and often cruel character, is considered by Machiavelli to be an exemplary prince in his use of deceptive strategies. Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, used deception and manipulation strategically to expand his power in Italy. Through false alliances, diplomatic lies, and veiled coercion, Borgia managed to consolidate his rule in territories that would otherwise have been inaccessible to him. Machiavelli also discusses how Borgia, in his rise to power, used religion, military cunning, and deceptive diplomacy to eliminate political rivals and secure control of key territories. Although Borgia failed to maintain power in the long term due to circumstances beyond his control, for Machiavelli, he was a perfect example of how deception can be a powerful tool in politics. The prince and the manipulation of his own image. Finally, Machiavelli emphasizes that the prince must be very aware of the public image he projects. Although the prince may be calculating and manipulative in private, he must make his public actions appear fair, honest, and morally correct. The ideal prince is one who knows when to use deception for his own ends and when to appear as a godly leader, even if his actions are strategically calculated. Conclusion of the chapter. Machiavelli concludes that deception and manipulation are essential tools in politics, and that a prince must be a master of these practices. While honesty and morality may be valuable in some cases, political reality requires that the prince be willing to deceive, manipulate, and disguise his intentions to maintain his power and ensure the success of his principality. A prince who does not know how to use deception effectively is destined to be surpassed by his enemies or replaced by those who are capable of manipulating circumstances in his favor. Therefore, cunning and the ability to deceive are not only necessary but also essential for any prince seeking success in the political game. Chapter 13. The Prince and Morals. In this chapter, Niccolò Machiavelli addresses the relationship between the prince and morality. Machiavelli establishes that traditional morality and ethical principles are not always compatible with the demands of political power. Throughout the chapter, the tensions between what is morally correct and what is strategically effective for the prince are discussed. The author argues that, in many cases, a prince must be willing to act contrary to conventional moral principles if this is necessary to ensure his power and the stability of the principality. Morality in politics. Machiavelli begins the chapter by recognizing that morality is a set of principles that traditionally guide human behavior. However, He emphasizes that politics, and especially statecraft, is not governed by the same rules as personal morality. In many cases, a prince must make decisions that violate moral norms if it ensures the well-being of the principality and the stability of power. The author states that, although morality is an important guide in the lives of individuals, a prince must be able to adapt to circumstances and make pragmatic decisions, even if those decisions do not conform to what society considers morally correct. A prince who strictly follows morality can be harmed by his own principles, since the political field is complex and interests and challenges are constantly changing. The need to be loved and feared, not just good. One of the key concepts that Machiavelli introduces in this chapter is the need to be loved and feared, but if a prince has to choose between being loved or feared, it is better that he be feared. This is because love in politics is volatile and can disappear quickly if the prince loses power or fails to meet the expectations of his people. On the other hand, fear is more constant and can ensure that the subjects respect the prince, even if they do not love him. Machiavelli points out that a wise prince must be able to use both feelings strategically, winning the love of the people when possible, but always ensuring that his authority is feared to avoid rebellion and betrayal. In this sense, a prince must not be completely good in the traditional sense, but must be able to apply tactics that ensure his power, such as calculated cruelty or strategic manipulation. The relationship between virtue and morality. Machiavelli introduces the concept of virtue as a quality that the prince must have, but clarifies that it does not always coincide with traditional morality. In his work, virtue refers to the prince's ability to adapt to circumstances and make decisions that strengthen him. Virtue is not synonymous with morality. In fact, in many cases, virtue may involve acting harshly or deceiving to protect the principality, while traditional morality would require the prince to behave honestly and compassionately, which may result in his loss of power. Machiavelli uses the example of Caesar Borgia, who, although cruel at times, acted with great political virtue because he understood the importance of making ruthless decisions to consolidate his power. Despite his lack of compassion in some aspects, his political virtuosity allowed him to maintain control over the territories he conquered. The prince and the use of morality according to circumstances. In this chapter, Machiavelli suggests that a prince must adjust his behavior according to the specific circumstances in which he finds himself. Sometimes the prince must behave in a morally upright manner, while at other times he must act in an immoral or calculating manner to ensure the best interests of the principality. According to Machiavelli, the prince who acts rigidly according to a strict moral code risks losing power in the face of the complexities of the political world. The prince must be able to camouflage his behavior according to what the situation demands. This involves knowing when to show compassion and when to be ruthless. Morality, in this context, should not be seen as an absolute value, but as a flexible tool that must be adapted to policy. The relationship with the church and morality. Machiavelli also analyzes how the relationship with the church and religious values influence the prince's policies. Although religion can be used as a legitimizing resource, a prince should not feel limited by religious moral principles. In fact, Machiavelli advises that the prince use religion and moral values to strengthen his rule and justify his actions, even when his decisions go against what religious morality would dictate. In many cases, the church can be a strategic ally in consolidating power, but the prince must be willing to challenge or manipulate it if his interests require it. The morality of the church can be used to appease the people, but it should not be followed blindly if it goes against political interest. The need for moral adaptability. Finally, Machiavelli concludes this chapter by highlighting that a successful prince is one who knows how to adapt his morality according to the challenges he faces. The prince must be able to recognize when he should act morally and when he should be pragmatic, understanding that politics does not always follow the rules of traditional morality. Ultimately, what matters is maintaining power, and the prince who achieves this, regardless of the means, is the one considered virtuous in the Machiavellian sense of the term. This chapter reaffirms the central idea that politics, according to Machiavelli, is governed by reality and not by absolute moral principles. A prince must be flexible in his morality, act pragmatically, and be willing to set aside traditional morality when necessary to maintain your power and ensure the stability of your government. Chapter 14. Neutrality and War. In this chapter, Niccolò Machiavelli analyzes the relationship between neutrality and war and how a prince must manage military alliances and war conflicts to ensure survival and power in his principality. Machiavelli makes an important distinction between defensive war and offensive war, highlighting how neutrality can be useful in certain circumstances, but can also be dangerous if not handled correctly. War as a central element of power. Machiavelli begins the chapter by stating that war is an essential part of the political life of any prince. In his vision, a prince must always be prepared for war, since, throughout history, war conflicts are inevitable. A prince who does not prepare for war or who ignores the importance of military forces risks being overthrown by internal or external enemies. The defense of the principality and the expansion of power require a solid military strategy. War is not only necessary to protect the territory, but also to strengthen the power of the prince, since through war, he can expand his domains and demonstrate his ability to make firm decisions. A prince who does not get involved in war may be perceived as weak or lacking ambition. Neutrality, a risk or an opportunity. Although war is inevitable, Machiavelli also talks about the option of neutrality in certain cases. In situations where military conflicts between other powers do not directly affect the principality, the prince may choose to remain neutral to avoid the destruction and costs that war entails. However, neutrality has its risks, as the prince must ensure that his enemies do not grow stronger while he remains on the sidelines. Machiavelli warns that neutrality is only effective when the prince is able to maintain a position of strength. If a prince appears weak while remaining neutral, he may be attacked by other states who perceive his lack of action as an opportunity to expand. However, if the prince maintains a strong army and is willing to act if necessary, neutrality can be a smart strategy to avoid unnecessary conflict. Offensive warfare. Expansion of power. Machiavelli also discusses the role of offensive war in the expansion of a principality. In this sense, war is not only a defensive tool but also an active strategy to increase the power of the prince. The author argues that a prince who does not seek to expand his domain may become trapped in a situation of stagnation and miss opportunities to increase his influence. Offensive warfare is especially useful when a prince has the opportunity to attack a weak rival or when he can conquer territories that offer economic or strategic benefits. However, Machiavelli warns that offensive war must be carefully planned. The prince must assess the risks and ensure that he has the resources necessary to sustain the conflict until he achieves his objectives. Defensive warfare. Safeguarding the principality. On the other hand, defensive warfare is equally important for a prince who wishes to preserve his power and defend his principality. Machiavelli emphasizes that a prince must be prepared to defend his territory against any invasion. Defensive warfare, although generally more costly and exhausting, is crucial to maintaining sovereignty and ensuring the security of its people. A good prince must be able to quickly organize his forces to resist any aggression, and to do so, he must maintain a well-trained army and an effective defense system. Additionally, a prince must be strategic in his use of resources during defensive warfare to prevent his people from suffering too much during the conflict. Diplomacy and international alliances. In the context of war, Machiavelli also emphasizes the importance of international alliances. A prince must be able to create strategic alliances with other nations to strengthen his position and confront his enemies. Alliances must be carefully selected to ensure that allies are loyal and that their participation in the war is beneficial to the principality. However, Machiavelli warns that alliances should not be taken lightly, as allies may betray or outlive their usefulness. A prince must be prepared to break alliances when they are no longer advantageous or when his power allows him to handle threats himself. The case of war in history. To illustrate his ideas about war, Machiavelli uses several historical examples of great military leaders who knew how to manage their forces and war tactics well. Alexander the Great, for example, is cited as a leader who used offensive warfare to expand his empire very successfully. However, Machiavelli also points out that war does not always lead to success, as figures such as Caesar Borgia and Louis XII of France, despite their military efforts, failed to consolidate their power due to poor strategic decisions. The importance of preparation. Machiavelli concludes the chapter by highlighting the importance of always being prepared for war. Even when war is not immediate, the prince must maintain a strong military infrastructure, strengthen his army, and train his troops. Constant preparation is vital to ensure that the principality can defend itself and expand at the right time. Chapter conclusion. In conclusion, this chapter highlights that war, both defensive and offensive, is a key tool in the management of a prince's power. Neutrality can be helpful in certain cases, but a prince who isolates himself too much or avoids conflict risks losing influence and being seen as weak. The key to success lies in using war strategically, with a careful balance between military readiness, diplomatic alliances, and a firm response to threats. A prince who manages to manage war with cunning, resolve, and strategy can secure his power and expand his influence. War, while destructive, is an indispensable tool for those seeking to consolidate their dominance on the political stage. Chapter 15. Maintaining Power in Times of Crisis. In this chapter, Niccolò Machiavelli discusses how a prince must manage his power during times of crisis or external threats. Machiavelli argues that moments of political turbulence, such as wars or internal conflicts, are what really test a prince's ability to maintain control over his principality. The prince's ability to adapt quickly to these circumstances and make decisive decisions can determine his success or failure. The nature of the political crisis. Machiavelli explains that a crisis can arise in a variety of ways: a foreign invasion, an internal revolution, or even a series of bad decisions that weaken the prince's authority. Regardless of its origin, the crisis represents a decisive test of the prince's ability to maintain control. In this context, firmness and quick decision are essential. A prince must be prepared to face any challenge intelligently and calculatedly, without being taken by surprise. The crisis can be a moment of opportunity or destruction, depending on how it is handled. If handled correctly, it can strengthen the principality and further consolidate the prince's power, but if mishandled, it can completely destabilize the government. Agility and adaptability. In times of crisis, Machiavelli stresses that the prince must be agile and able to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Rigidity or slowness in decision-making can lead to a quick defeat. The prince must know how to react in a timely manner to threats, whether external or internal, to prevent the crisis from becoming an existential threat to the principality. For example, Machiavelli mentions that an intelligent prince must not only prepare for conflicts preventively, but must also have contingency plans. This means always being ready to change strategy as events demand, demonstrating your ability to handle uncertainty. The use of force and violence in the crisis. In times of crisis that threaten the stability of the principality, Machiavelli maintains that a prince must be willing to use force in a calculated manner. Although Machiavelli recognizes that violence and repression are often viewed negatively, in certain contexts they are essential to quickly eliminate threats and restore order. The key, according to Machiavelli, is knowing when and how to use force to prevent the people from turning against the prince. For example, if the prince faces an internal revolution, he must act quickly to stop the rebellion before it spreads. Temporary cruelty may be necessary to restore authority, but it should not be prolonged longer than necessary, as it can alienate the population and cause resentment. The political strategy consists of being decisive in the crisis, but also of preserving the image of the prince before the people. The importance of internal unity. Machiavelli highlights that in times of crisis, the prince must be able to unify his people, creating a sense of cohesion and solidarity. In times of instability, it is essential for the prince to get the different groups within his principality to unite around the idea of overcoming the crisis. This may involve making concessions or forming strategic alliances with different factions within the principality, ensuring that power is not fragmented and that all sectors work to restore order. A successful prince knows that internal unity is the most powerful force he can have in times of crisis. If the people see that the prince is committed to unifying the principality, they are more likely to support his efforts to overcome adversity. The role of diplomacy in the crisis. In some cases, the external crisis can be mitigated through diplomatic strategies. Machiavelli emphasizes that intelligent diplomacy is a key tool for a prince facing an international crisis. Rather than resorting to war immediately, a prudent prince may choose to negotiate with enemies and seek alliances that will strengthen him against a common threat. Diplomacy can also be useful in dividing enemies or neutralizing external threats without resorting to costly armed conflict. Machiavelli suggests that, in certain cases, the prince must take advantage of other people's conflicts to benefit and maintain stability within his own principality. The prince as a leader in the crisis. The author highlights that in times of crisis, the prince must demonstrate leadership and determination. Crises are often times when princes are tested, and a prince who is indecisive or wavers in his decisions will be quickly overcome. The prince must project an image of control and security so that the people trust in his ability to resolve the crisis. The prince's presence is vital. Confidence in his leadership is what will maintain the stability of the principality, even when external or internal events threaten to undermine it. Overflow it. The prince should be seen as someone who makes difficult decisions and is willing to take drastic measures if necessary to ensure the future of the principality. Crisis resolution as an opportunity to consolidate power. Machiavelli concludes this chapter by highlighting that, while crises are challenges, they can also be opportunities for a prince who handles the situation well. A prince who successfully confronts a crisis can strengthen his power and gain the respect and loyalty of his people. By effectively resolving the crisis, the prince will not only restore order, but will also consolidate his control and may even expand his influence. A good prince uses crisis as a platform to demonstrate his ability, increasing his legitimacy and authority. Machiavelli emphasizes that wise leaders see crisis as a moment of empowerment, since they are in control of the results and can imprint their stamp of power on the events that follow. This chapter of Machiavelli highlights the importance of decisive and strategic action in times of crisis. Flexibility, adaptability, and effective resource management are crucial for a prince to maintain his power and overcome adversity. A prince who knows how to unify his people, maintain internal control, and act quickly and firmly during a crisis will be the one who manages to strengthen his power and secure the future of his principality. Chapter 16. The Prince and Civil Values. In this chapter, Niccolò Machiavelli examines the relationship between the prince and the civic values of his people. Machiavelli discusses how a prince must cultivate certain virtues within his kingdom to ensure the stability and unity of his government. Throughout this chapter, Machiavelli reflects on how civil values, such as honesty, justice, and bravery, play a fundamental role in consolidating power and strengthening the relationship between the prince and his people. The importance of civic values in politics. Machiavelli begins by stating that civic values are essential to the stability of a principality. A prince who encourages virtue and values within his society can ensure loyalty and popular support, making governance easier. Civic values such as honesty, mutual respect, and justice allow the prince to be perceived not only as an authoritarian ruler, but also as a just and moral leader. However, Machiavelli also emphasizes that the prince must be pragmatic and recognize that not all civic values can be strictly applied at all times. In the exercise of power, it may be necessary to modify or adjust these values according to the circumstances facing the prince, as political interests and the survival of the principality may conflict with the highest moral principles. Creating a common sense of justice. A key aspect of government is justice, which must be administered so that all citizens feel protected and treated equitably. Machiavelli highlights that a prince must have the ability to define justice according to the needs of the principality, without being a slave to a rigid morality that prevents him from making difficult decisions. A just ruler is one who ensures the common welfare, adapting the laws and the administration of justice to the realities and circumstances of his time. However, Machiavelli also warns that a prince who is too focused on justice can be perceived as weak, as enemies and rivals can exploit this perception of compassion to challenge his authority. The prince must be flexible and know when to harden his approach to justice to ensure control, especially in times of conflict or instability. The relationship between civic values and social peace. Machiavelli stresses that the prince must use civic values as a way to maintain social peace within the principality. A prince who promotes civic virtue and the common good generates a cohesive society, where citizens are willing to work together to strengthen the principality. This sense of unity is essential to prevent the formation of factions or opposition groups that could destabilize power. In this context, civic education plays a crucial role. Machiavelli suggests that the prince should educate and train his people in the values that will strengthen the sense of community. This includes training in loyalty to the state, respect for the law, and obedience to the prince. The more morally strong the society, the more difficult it is for external or internal enemies to take advantage of divisions to overthrow the prince. The prince as a model of virtue. Although Machiavelli is known for his pragmatic and realistic approach to politics, he also emphasizes that the prince should be a model of virtue for the people. A prince who behaves honestly and dignified not only generates respect, but also positively influences the citizens, who will follow his example. The prince who acts with integrity in his personal and public life manages to consolidate power because he becomes a symbol of moral authority. Machiavelli suggests that the prince should cultivate a public image of honesty and justice, but at the same time, be aware that princes who act solely in accordance with virtue can be exploited by their enemies. Therefore, the prince must be shrewd and understand when to show virtues and when to use other strategies that are necessary to maintain power. Civic dignity and popular perception. The author also talks about how civic dignity influences the public perception of the prince. If the prince shows dignity in his behavior and decisions, he will earn the respect and loyalty of his people. Dignity is not only a personal quality, but also a public manifestation that the prince is capable of making difficult decisions for the well-being of the principality. A prince who demonstrates dignity in times of political or economic difficulties manages to strengthen his position before his people, since people will see him as a strong and determined leader capable of handling adversity with wisdom. This dignity also acts as a symbol of stability, helping to prevent internal crises from becoming threats to the reign. The role of religion in civic values. Machiavelli also addresses religion as a tool to promote certain civic values. Religion has the power to unite people under a common set of principles and can be used by the prince to strengthen public morality and legitimize his power. In times of crisis or conflict, the prince may turn to religion to rebuild unity and foster peace in the principality. However, Machiavelli is also aware that religion can be a double-edged sword. Although it can be a powerful resource for maintaining peace and loyalty, it can also be used by enemies to undermine the prince's authority. For this reason, the prince must manage religion strategically without allowing religious leaders or ecclesiastical institutions to become rivals to his power. Conclusion of the chapter. Machiavelli concludes this chapter by noting that civic values are fundamental to the unity and stability of a principality. The prince must be a model of virtue, promoting justice, honesty, and dignity in his government, but always with a pragmatic approach that allows him to adapt his behavior according to political circumstances. Civic values must be used not only as a moral tool, but also as a political strategy to strengthen the government and win the loyalty of the people. The prince must understand that politics does not always follow the rules of traditional morality, and that sometimes it will be necessary to adjust or adapt values according to the needs of the principality. However, a prince who cultivates a virtuous society and maintains a strong relationship with his people can guarantee the permanence of his power and ensure a stable and lasting government. Chapter 17. The reality of absolute power. In this chapter, Niccolò Machiavelli addresses the reality of absolute power, analyzing the advantages and disadvantages of an absolutist principality. Machiavelli reflects on power concentrated in a single figure, exploring the circumstances in which a prince can benefit from having complete control over his government, but also the threats and vulnerabilities that come with absolute power. This chapter focuses on the need to balance control and maintain power in the face of the internal and external challenges that a ruler faces. The nature of absolute power. Machiavelli begins the chapter by defining the concept of absolute power, explaining that it is the type of power where the prince has complete authority over the principality and is not subject to no external restrictions, not even by laws or institutions. The prince has complete control over the political, economic, and social aspects of his government. This type of power gives you the freedom to make decisions without consulting other bodies of power or the people. However, Machiavelli emphasizes that absolute power can be both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it allows the prince to act quickly, without having to negotiate or consult with other figures of power. This can be advantageous when you need to respond decisively to crisis situations or sudden changes. The prince with absolute power has the ability to make quick decisions without the limitations that a more democratic or representative system might impose. The benefits of power concentration: an absolute prince has the ability to act without restraint, allowing him to move quickly and effectively at critical moments. This is especially valuable when facing external threats or internal rebellions. Machiavelli mentions that absolute princes, such as Louis XI of France, managed to consolidate their power through quick and decisive actions, without being interrupted by parliamentary debates or political opposition. Furthermore, unity of power can prevent fragmentation and internal divisions, ensuring that the government remains cohesive. An absolute prince can be more efficient in his policies because he has full control over the state apparatus and does not have to constantly negotiate or compromise with other political actors. This can make the government more stable, since the central authority is not divided between different power groups. The risks of absolute power, however, Machiavelli is also aware of the dangers that come with absolute power. The main risk is that the absolute prince becomes an object of resentment and mistrust among his people and his courtiers. Lack of consultation or participation from other factions can lead to the prince losing popular and government support, as he may be seen as arrogant, unfair, or despotic. Furthermore, an absolute prince is very vulnerable to external attacks and internal confrontations if he fails to maintain the loyalty of his people and his armed forces. The concentration of power in a single figure can lead a prince to rely too much on his own ability, without the support of strong institutions or other power actors who can protect the principality in times of crisis. If the prince loses the support of his army or his main advisors, his fall will be inevitable. The vulnerability of the prince absolute: Machiavelli warns that the prince who rules absolutely may face great vulnerability if his decisions negatively affect the people or power groups within the principality. The lack of control over representative bodies and the absence of opposition mechanisms can lead to widespread discontent. In such circumstances, the prince can be quickly overthrown if he does not have popular support or loyal forces behind him. Machiavelli mentions that a prince who acts with tyranny or who does not listen to his people can be perceived as an enemy and easily overthrown. Lack of legitimacy or moral support is one of the weakest points of an absolute prince, as subjects may rebel if they feel that the oppression is too strong or disproportionate. The role of military force in absolute power: an absolute prince, according to Machiavelli, must have a loyal and well-trained army to defend against external threats and maintain internal stability. Military force is vital for a prince who seeks to maintain absolute power, since his security depends directly on his ability to control the armed forces. If the prince loses control over the army, his power will quickly crumble, regardless of how absolute his control over the civil government is. It is crucial that the prince be pragmatic and astute when managing his army, to prevent his soldiers from becoming a focus of dissent or rebellion. Additionally, you must ensure that your forces are well motivated, as a disgruntled militia can be easily manipulated by rivals to overthrow you. The contrast between a prince absolute and a prince-elect: Machiavelli also distinguishes between an absolute prince and an elected or hereditary prince. The prince who inherits his power has a basis of legitimacy that gives him a certain stability, since traditional dynasties are usually respected by the people. Instead, an absolute prince, especially one who assumes power by conquest or personal appointment, must actively work to gain popular acceptance and legitimize his power. A crown prince generally has a stronger base of support as his rule is based on tradition, while an absolute prince must build his own legitimacy and will often face more challenges from those who do not automatically accept his power. The relationship with the church: Machiavelli also mentions that the absolute prince must be astute in his relationship with the church. While an absolute prince has control over the principality, the church can be an important source of legitimacy and popular support. Sometimes a prince must consolidate his power using religion as a tool, either by aligning himself with the clergy or using popular religion to gain moral support among the population. Conclusion of the chapter. Machiavelli concludes that, although absolute power offers the possibility of making quick and strategic decisions without opposition, it also comes with great risks. The prince must carefully balance his autocracy with popular support and must be prepared to act decisively when the stability of your reign is threatened. A prince who effectively maintains his absolute power is one who combined strength, political cunning, and popular legitimacy to build a lasting and stable principality. This chapter highlights the fragility of absolute power, suggesting that princes must be pragmatic and always prepared to act quickly in the face of the risks inherent in a total concentration of power. Chapter 18. Natural Laws and Politics. In this chapter, Niccolò Machiavelli addresses the relationship between natural laws and politics, arguing that the principles of human nature and the laws that govern societies must be understood and applied by the prince to ensure the stability and success of his government. Machiavelli points out that politics is not governed exclusively by moral or legal principles, but also by the immutable laws of human nature, which influence the actions and decisions of individuals within society. Natural laws as the foundation of government. Machiavelli begins the chapter by suggesting that natural laws, understood as the instincts and motivations inherent to human beings, must be recognized and taken advantage of by the prince. These laws cannot be ignored, since human actions are always shaped by ambition, selfishness, and the desire for power. The prince must understand that these forces are inevitable and, in many cases, form the basis of all political and social decisions. The prince must be astute in recognizing these instincts in his subjects and adjusting his policies to take advantage of them. Rather than trying to counteract or defy natural laws, a wise ruler works with them to maintain order and ensure cohesion within the principality. Machiavelli states that a prince must be realistic and pragmatic, recognizing that politics is not a game of abstract ideals, but of fundamental human realities. Human behavior and political decisions. The author analyzes how human behaviors are determined by natural instincts that drive both individual and collective actions. According to Machiavelli, human societies are influenced by the same natural laws that affect individuals. These include the desire for power, competition, and the need for survival. Through these impulses, individuals seek to improve their position within the social and political hierarchy, which generates conflicts but also the cohesion necessary for the functioning of a society. Politics, therefore, should not be understood only from an idealistic or moralistic point of view, but from a political realism that recognizes human limitations. A prince who faces human nature realistically will be able to make use of human virtues and counteract his vices effectively. This means managing human relationships with a mix of political strategy and cunning, understanding that ambition and the pursuit of power are powerful forces that cannot be eliminated, but can be channeled towards beneficial objectives for the principality. The need to control emotions and instincts. Machiavelli also addresses the need to control human emotions within the principality. While natural laws, such as the desire for power and selfishness, are inevitable, the prince must be able to manage the emotions of his subjects to avoid destructive conflicts and maintain order. The control of human passions becomes an essential skill for the prince, since overflowing emotions, such as anger or fear, can trigger revolts or rebellions. A good prince knows how to exploit human emotions when necessary, but he must also be able to neutralize them to prevent his political decisions from being influenced by impulsive feelings. In this sense, the ability to manage the temperament and passions of his people becomes an essential tool for the consolidation of power. The prince and the manipulation of human nature. The chapter also explores how the prince can manipulate natural laws in his favor. Machiavelli suggests that a prince must be intelligent and astute in his dealings with human emotions and instincts, not only to maintain power but also to strengthen his rule. The prince must create an image of power that fosters respect and fear in his people, while at the same time he must allay his people's fears and ensure that no revolts arise that could destabilize his regime. Deception and manipulation are tools that the prince can use to assert his power without constantly resorting to violence. Machiavelli argues that the prince must be able to shape the perception of his people so that, even if his decisions are seen as selfish or unjust, the prince will be able to justify them or make them acceptable through cunning. The relationship between morality and natural laws. Machiavelli also introduces the discussion of morality in this context. While natural laws govern the behavior of individuals, morality can be seen as a social construct that is in constant conflict with these laws. The prince must recognize that traditional morality does not always coincide with the political needs of the state. Often, a prince must make decisions that are ethically immoral but politically necessary to ensure the stability of the principality. In this sense, Machiavelli emphasizes that the most successful princes are not those who strictly adhere to traditional morality, but those who are able to act flexibly and adapt to the political realities of the moment, using the natural laws of humanity to preserve its power. Conclusion of the chapter. Machiavelli concludes this chapter by highlighting that politics, to be effective, must be based on a deep understanding of the natural laws that govern human nature. The prince must use these laws to strengthen his rule, knowing when to take advantage of human passions and when to suppress them to prevent them from interfering with the stability of the principality. Cunning, realism, and adaptability are essential to maintaining power and ensuring the prince's permanence in government. This chapter emphasizes the pragmatic flexibility of a prince who must, at all times, be aware of the social and psychological dynamics that affect his people in order to govern with wisdom and decision. Chapter 19. The Prince's Inheritance. In this chapter, Niccolò Machiavelli explores the importance of inheritance and legacy in the political context of a principality. Throughout the work, Machiavelli emphasizes that a prince must not only focus on maintaining power in the present, but also on ensuring the survival of his lineage and the legacy of his rule. This chapter discusses how a prince can ensure the continuity of his principality through a proper succession plan and how the transition of power should be managed in a way that avoids destabilization or chaos. The importance of inheritance for the prince. Machiavelli begins this chapter by emphasizing that a prince must think about the future and consider how his legacy will be perceived by generations to come. Inheritance, in political terms, refers not only to the transmission of power to the prince's children, but also to how the state and institutions that the prince has established are preserved. The prince must be astute in choosing his successor and ensure that the principality does not crumble upon his death or fall. A prince's legacy is not only determined by the transition of power but also by the reforms and decisions he makes throughout his life. If a prince rules with wisdom, strength, and justice, he can ensure that his inheritance is respected and valued by his subjects, even after his death. Prince succession, a key factor for stability. Machiavelli places special emphasis on succession as one of the most critical elements of politics. Clear and stable succession is essential to ensure the continuity of the principality and prevent disputes or civil war from destroying what the prince has achieved during his lifetime. According to Machiavelli, a prince must groom and educate his successor to ensure that he is a competent leader who can maintain control and strengthen the principality. Machiavelli suggests that the prince must observe and train his heir throughout his life, ensuring that he learns the virtues necessary to rule. A prince who does not worry about ensuring a good succession runs the risk of leaving a power vacuum that can be exploited by rivals or enemies. Inheritance in hereditary and new principalities. Machiavelli distinguishes between hereditary principalities and new principalities, and how inheritance plays a different role in each case. In a hereditary principality, the successor usually does not have to work as hard to gain the legitimacy that the founding prince has already secured, as the people respect dynastic continuity. The crown prince has a solid foundation on which he can build his reign. In a new principality, however, succession is more delicate, as the new prince needs to demonstrate his ability to assert himself and win the loyalty of the people. Machiavelli warns that, in this type of principality, the prince must work harder to consolidate his power and ensure that there is no confusion or mistrust when it comes to the transition of power. Choosing a successor. Machiavelli emphasizes the importance of the prince choosing his successor wisely. The political skill and wisdom of the successor are essential to prevent the principality from collapsing after the prince's death. If the successor does not have the qualities necessary to rule, Even the most solid of principalities can fall into decay. The prince must choose a successor who shares his vision and is able to stay the course. A poorly chosen or weak successor can give rise to intrigues or internal conflicts that destabilize the government. If the prince does not have a fit son, he can opt for a nephew, son-in-law, or even a loyal general who has demonstrated skills in administration or in war. The relevance of popular support in the succession. Machiavelli stresses that popular approval is crucial to the legitimacy of the successor. A prince who has managed to rule successfully must ensure that his successor is well received by the people, as the loyalty of the people is what guarantees stability. In this regard, the prince must prepare his successor to be approved by the people, ensuring that he is not only competent, but also enjoys respect and credibility. The heritage of the mixed principalities. Machiavelli also considers mixed principalities, those that result from the conquest or fusion of several territories under a single ruler. In these cases, inheritance is particularly difficult, as the successor must ensure that all territories under his control remain loyal and do not fracture due to internal rivalries or divisions. The prince in a mixed principality must work to properly integrate the different parts of his domain, fostering unity and loyalty that ensures a succession without conflict. Machiavelli advises that the prince who inherits a mixed principality should confront and suppress any challenge to his authority from the outset, to prevent the successor from being seen as weak or incapable. Preparation for death. The prince's legacy. Finally, Machiavelli concludes this chapter by highlighting the importance of the prince preparing for his death from the moment he assumes power. This includes not only ensuring a good succession, but also preparing the principality for a smooth and conflict-free transition. Careful succession planning is one of the keys to ensuring the perpetuity of the principality and preventing it from disintegrating after the death of the prince. The prince who leaves a strong, well-established legacy ensures that his dynasty and rule endure, even when he is no longer present. This depends not only on choosing a good successor, but also on effective management of institutions, laws, and foreign relations to ensure that the principality remains strong. Conclusion of the chapter. In conclusion, Machiavelli highlights that inheritance is an essential aspect for any prince who wishes to leave a lasting legacy. The election of the successor, the preparation of the succession, and the guarantee of popular loyalty are key elements to ensure that the principality does not disintegrate after the death of the prince. A wise and foresight prince ensures that his power is not only maintained, but strengthened by future generations. This chapter reinforces the importance of long-term planning and strategic thinking to ensure that the principality survives beyond the lifetime of the ruler, consolidating its heritage and ensuring the perpetuity of power and political stability. Chapter 20. Conclusion. The perpetuity of the principality. In this final chapter, Niccolò Machiavelli reflects on the perpetuity of the principality and how a prince must manage all the elements that have been discussed in the previous chapters to ensure the longevity and stability of his rule. Machiavelli summarizes the key ideas about how a prince can maintain his power over time, face adversity, and, above all, ensure that his principality endures, even after his death. The nature of lasting power. Machiavelli emphasizes that political power depends not only on the military strength or individual skill of a prince, but also on the prince's ability to adapt to changing circumstances and preserve stability within his principality. The perpetuity of the principality is achieved through a combination of wisdom, cunning, and pragmatism. A prince must be flexible, visionary, and decisive in making decisions that not only ensure his own power, but also the long-term security and prosperity of the principality. Machiavelli also warns that long-term stability can only be achieved if the prince acts prudently, avoiding both excessive despotism and lack of authority. A principality that balances fear and respect, that is based on good administration, and that ensures that the interests of the people are aligned with those of the prince, has a better chance of perpetuating itself. The importance of adaptability. One of the central ideas that Machiavelli conveys is that adaptability is key to perpetuity. Circumstances are constantly changing, and a prince who does not adapt to these changes is doomed to inevitable fall. Whether in the field of foreign relations, war, or internal management, a prince must always be willing to adjust his strategy according to the political and social conditions of the moment. Machiavelli mentions historical examples of princes who knew how to adapt to their times and managed to perpetuate their power, such as Caesar Borgia, who, although he was not successful in the long term, used his cunning to consolidate his rule while he could. On the other hand, those princes who were stuck in a rigid approach or disregarded the changing needs of society were the ones who failed. The role of virtue and fortune. Machiavelli also reminds us that the ideal prince must be able to handle virtue, personal skill and wisdom, and fortune, luck or unforeseen events. While virtue is the key to rational decisions and the management of power, fortune can play an important role in the stability of a principality. The prince must know how to take advantage of the opportunities that fortune offers him, while maintaining control of his actions and ensuring that his decisions are always aligned with the interests of the principality. The balance between virtue and fortune is what determines whether a principality will last or succumb to the uncertainties of fate. Machiavelli points out that some princes, despite possessing great virtues, failed to remain in power due to bad luck or adverse fortune. However, those who are able to navigate the whims of fortune with wisdom are the ones who manage to consolidate their power and leave a lasting legacy. The role of external forces and diplomacy. The prince must also be astute in foreign relations and know how to use diplomacy as a tool to ensure the security of his principality. In the context of external threats or war conflicts, the prince who knows how to manage alliances and strengthen his diplomatic position will have a significant advantage. At the same time, it must avoid being too dependent on other nations and maintain political and economic independence. Machiavelli points out that the prince must use changes in the international balance in his favor, adapting and using circumstances to ensure his power. This may involve changing alliances, using conflict as a strategy, or even using diplomatic trickery to strengthen your position. The education and preparation of the new generation. Machiavelli also emphasizes that the preparation of the next generation of leaders is essential for the perpetuity of the principality. The prince must ensure that his successors are well educated, trained in civic values, and ready to face the challenges of power. A principality that does not invest in the education of its successor is in danger of being destabilized following the death or fall of the current prince. A prince's legacy depends not only on his personal actions, but on how he builds the power and transition structure to ensure his principality continues to prosper after he is gone. Machiavelli suggests that a prince must carefully prepare the succession to avoid the instability that often accompanies the lack of a clear succession structure. Perpetuity through law and institutions. Finally, Machiavelli concludes that the perpetuity of the principate also depends on strengthening institutions and creating lasting laws that ensure stability beyond the life of the prince. If the prince establishes solid foundations in law, justice, and public administration, his principality will be less likely to collapse after his death. Internal cohesion, achieved through efficient administration and fair legislation, ensures that the principality survives as a strong entity. Conclusion of the chapter. In conclusion, Machiavelli emphasizes that the perpetuity of the principality depends on adaptability, political wisdom, the education of the next generation, and the ability to maintain control both in times of crisis and in times of peace. A prince must be able to navigate the turbulent waters of fortune with a firm strategy, while ensuring that the institutions and laws he leaves behind are strong enough to sustain his legacy. The perpetuity of a principality is not achieved by absolute power alone, but by cunning, pragmatism, and a visionary approach that ensures that the principality survives through the generations. Machiavelli concludes that a prince must constantly work to strengthen his rule, consolidate his power, and ensure that his legacy endures even when he is no longer around. And with this we come to the end of this in-depth analysis of The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. Throughout this audiobook, we have explored the fundamental principles that guide power and politics and how a prince can ensure its success and perpetuity. Machiavelli, with his realistic and pragmatic vision, has shown us that politics is not based on traditional morality, but on cunning, pragmatism, and adaptability. We have learned that power is not maintained by virtue alone, but also by cunning, strength, and the ability to navigate the turbulent waters of fortune. This book is an essential manual for understanding the ins and outs of power and how a leader can manage the difficulties and opportunities that come their way. Without a doubt, Machiavelli's teachings remain relevant and useful for those seeking to understand the dynamics of power and leadership in the contemporary world. If you liked this summary and found it useful, don't forget to subscribe to our Audiomentors channel. Here we continue bringing you summaries and reflections of the great books that have marked the history of thought